Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I'm writing these words at my old oak desk, in my apartment, lit only by the yellowish glow of a lamp. I never thought I'd have the courage to confess what I've experienced, but I can no longer carry this guilt alone day and night. I don't know if I'm seeking pure relief by telling this story, or if deep down, I still nurture a glimmer of hope of being understood. What I do know is that my life took such a dramatic turn that sometimes I feel like I'm no longer myself. And it all began long before I even realized what it meant to betray my principles. I was born in a modest neighborhood near a cluster of abandoned industrial warehouses in Boston. Actually, I'm not sure I can say near. They were more than 5 blocks away, but the structures were so tall that I could always see those grayish silhouettes on the horizon. My father worked as a police detective, a serious man with a calm temperament, but firm when he needed to be. Every dawn before the sun rose, he'd wake up, put on his badge, and leave for patrol. I'd hear his footsteps in the narrow hallway, the jingling of keys on his belt, and the dry sound of his holster hitting his leg. My mother, a religious woman of restrained gestures, would walk him to the door. She always said she'd pray for him, for our family, and for people's honesty. The curious thing is that even in such a modest home, I felt there was something special about my childhood. My father, returning from work, would often repeat a phrase that deeply marked me. An honest man doesn't sell himself, Lucas, no matter the circumstance. Then he'd kiss my mother's forehead and hug me, his uniform still smelling of sweat and dust. I remember that despite his tired shoulders, he never complained. Listening to his accounts of daily incidents, I realized how much injustice and misery he witnessed on the streets. Still, he maintained faith that doing good would be worthwhile. My deeply devout mother would add, "God blesses those who act with righteousness." I grew up with that hope hammering in my head. But as I got older, I began to see the world beyond our domestic bubble. On TV news, there were politicians being arrested or suspected of embezzling public funds. Brutal unsolved crimes, important people easily escaping accusations. Sometimes I'd mention this at the dinner table. "Dad, how do you manage to keep believing in justice?" He'd wipe his mouth with a napkin and say, "Because I know there are good people willing to fight, and that's why you'll have a better life than mine, Lucas. If I can teach you just one thing, it's don't sell yourself." Those words were like a mantra throughout my teenage years. Almost every night, my father would come home exhausted, but always gave me some advice about integrity. My mother patiently prayed with him and looked at me with that smile that mixed love and pride. It was in this context that I decided to study law at Harvard. I wanted to somehow carry forward the banner my father held, to defend the innocent and uphold the law righteously. I studied at a public high school without many resources, but managed good grades. I dreamed of entering a prestigious university, a place that would be the gateway to a solid career. I thought that with dedication, doors would open on merit. When I finished high school in 2005, I enrolled in the selection process for a renowned university. I spent sleepless nights studying philosophy texts, constitutional law, history, essay writing, and the effort paid off. I ended up being accepted. My parents could hardly believe it. I remember the tight hug I received from my father, who repeated with a gleam in his eyes, "An honest man doesn't sell himself." I smiled, thinking the world would bow to my convictions. At that moment, it didn't cross my mind how much reality could be distorted. The college experience was both wonderful and cruel. In the first few days, I noticed that many classmates had recognized surnames and lived in a universe very different from mine. Some arrived in luxury cars, wore expensive clothes, and talked about international trips as if they were weekend getaways to a cabin. Meanwhile, I arrived sweaty after facing overcrowded public transportation, wearing the best I had, which was still quite simple in comparison. At first, I tried not to care. I thought that with study and hard work, I could carve out a place for myself. But things weren't that simple. During this time, I began to hear stories that certain opportunities arose through connections. Those who had parents who were lawyers, uncles who were judges, or cousins in courts easily got internships. The most renowned professors invited children of influential people to research projects without even opening applications. I spent months distributing resumes throughout college, trying to get an internship position. I ended up receiving automated responses, or worse, no response at all. Once I confronted one of these professors, who made no effort to hide his elitism. "Your last name is Walker, Mr. Lucas Walker, and do you know anyone in the judiciary? Do you have relatives in politics?" I shook my head, and he gave a smirk that deeply hurt me. Still, I didn't give up. Through a childhood friend's recommendation, I got a part-time job at a clerk's office in downtown Boston, far from home, but it helped me cover the minimum costs of college. It was bureaucratic work, organizing folders and filing documents. At the same time, I strived to maintain high grades and succeeded despite the exhausting routine. I was building a decent academic record. My father, whenever he could, encouraged me, "Patience, son. The right path is the longest, but it's the only one that doesn't cost your soul." I agreed, although I was beginning to realize that in the outside world, honesty wasn't always immediately rewarded. Many people found shortcuts, and from what I saw, these shortcuts were tempting. In my final year of law school, I gave everything to my studies. I graduated with good grades. My father and mother came to the ceremony. It was a magical day, full of emotion. I remember thinking that finally the time had come to build a career as a lawyer and do justice to my father's words. I sent resumes to various firms, confident that academic dedication would open doors. The reality, however, was harsh. I received few interview invitations. In almost all of them, questions were geared toward contacts I might have, powerful relatives or acquaintances in the judiciary. When I said I had no famous relatives, interviewers became indifferent. This frustration ate away at me. After all, I had spent years working hard, but none of it seemed to matter. After several rejections and no decent salary offers, I ended up accepting a position at a small law firm in South Boston. It was in a less valuable neighborhood, in an old building that exuded mold in the corridors. I did the heavy lifting, drafting basic petitions, chasing certifications, facing long lines to file documents, and attending hearings. Sometimes I'd stay up all night because the firm took cases that few professionals were interested in defending, mostly humble people who couldn't afford big law firms. Even so, there were moments of hope. I remember once when an elderly widow came into the office with tears in her eyes because her husband had died at a construction site, and the company didn't want to compensate her. It was a simple case in theory. The company had been negligent, and there was concrete evidence. I threw myself into that case as if it were a chance to prove my worth. I researched labor laws, gathered technical opinions, photographed the site to attest to the lack of safety equipment. I presented everything to the senior attorney at the firm, who praised me for my dedication. On the day of the hearing, I myself made the oral argument, trembling with nervousness, but trusting in the solidity of my arguments. The construction company's representative, a well-dressed lawyer, looked at me with contempt. He went so far as to mention names of influential people, as if that was enough to end the matter. When I sat down to hear the verdict, the judge practically ignored the body of evidence I presented, and in the end, exempted the construction company from any responsibility. The widow broke down in tears. I felt a tightness in my chest, a mixture of anger and impotence. I tried to question the judge, asked if he would at least analyze the documents. He gave me a cold look and shot back, "Justice costs, counselor. If you can't pay, don't complain." That phrase echoed in my head for days. Leaving the courthouse that day was almost mechanical. I walked aimlessly, hearing the traffic noise but not really seeing anything. My education, my belief in the law, everything seemed useless. I arrived at the office with a downcast face. That's when one of the partners, Richard Matthews, approached me. He was a middle-aged man, average height, but who displayed uncommon confidence. He wore expensive suits and had a deep voice that made anyone stop to listen. "Lucas, want to understand how things really work?" he asked after seeing my state. I remained silent. My desire was to scream that the system was all wrong. Richard just gave a somewhat cynical smile. "There are always ways, but it requires that we be willing to play by the real rules, not those in the books." I backed away, confused. What rules would those be? He wasn't clear, but left a card on my desk with an address handwritten on it. I looked at that piece of paper for hours, thinking about what to do. The next day, when I arrived at the office, Richard stopped me again. "If you decide to find out, show up tomorrow at 10 at night." I went home thoughtful. I felt a certain curiosity mixed with a disgust I couldn't define. In the end, the frustration of having lost such a fair case spoke louder than apprehension. I thought, if there's something that can make a difference, I need to at least see it with my own eyes. So that night, I lied to my parents, saying I'd be working late, and took the subway to the indicated address in Beacon Hill. It was a hidden place in an area of large houses with high walls. The one I was looking for was old, with rusty gates, but there were still security guards at the entrance. I handed over the card. They didn't even ask my name, just opened the way. I followed a dimly lit corridor, feeling a rancid smell that reminded me of old incense and metal. I was already regretting it, but forced myself to continue. Upon reaching a large hall, I saw Richard talking quietly with 4 or 5 other people. I recognized two prosecutors and a circuit judge, whom I'd only seen on TV. There were also respected lawyers, people who appeared on covers of specialized magazines. The moment they noticed me, the judge moved away, but not before giving me a curious look, as if thinking, "Who is this rookie?" Richard led me to a table in the center of the hall. On it rested a thick black-covered book with an engraved symbol that I couldn't decipher. It was then that an older man with well-combed gray hair spoke to me calmly. "You want to stop losing cases, don't you?" My hands were sweating. I nodded without formulating a clear response. He opened that book, leafed through some pages, and stopped at one of them. With a subtle gesture, he brought forward a golden pen. "Just sign. You'll have the goodwill of judges and appellate judges. You might even grow beyond that." Richard, who was by my side, touched my shoulder. "It's the only way not to stagnate. But know that after signing, there's no going back." I felt a shiver. It seemed impossible that it could be so simple. But I remembered the unjustly treated widow. I remembered the hours of study wasted because of corruption. Something in me, overcome with hatred and desperation, took the pen before my brain could process what I was doing. I signed my name. A strange sensation took over the environment. I didn't see any explicit magic, but the air felt heavy and the rancid smell intensified. Even so, everyone acted naturally. After that, I left quietly with the impression of having crossed a portal of no return. I woke up the next day thinking it had all been a nightmare. But when I arrived at the office, I found my desk neatly arranged and a folder with a considerable real estate law case. Richard congratulated me. "They'll give you the space you deserve now, Lucas." I spent the week studying that case. On the day of the hearing, I was almost surprised when the judge supported my arguments without blinking. The ruling was favorable in record time. I was rewarded with a financial bonus that I would never have expected from such a small firm. I looked at Richard, who raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Understand now." Within weeks, I became the trusted man of the firm. Colleagues who had previously ignored me began to greet me with a certain respect. I increased my fees and suddenly could rent an apartment in a quieter area of the city. My parents were happy, although my father, suspicious, asked, "Are you sure all this is just the fruit of your work?" I gave some excuse, avoiding the subject. Deep down, the weight of that signature wouldn't stop throbbing in my conscience. But I convinced myself that it was just an opportunity, that I wasn't harming anyone. Time took care of proving otherwise. One day, an old college friend, Danny, sought me out. He remembered how, during university days, we dreamed of fighting corruption. Danny needed help with an environmental lawsuit against a company that was dumping toxic waste into a river near vulnerable communities. He had strong evidence, but feared that the company's lawyers, friends of appellate judges, could sabotage everything. "Lucas, you have influence now, don't you? Could you help give visibility to the case?" I was fidgeting with my phone, trying to look him in the eye. I remembered what giving visibility meant in that context. I would have to go against the same people who were helping me win cases so easily. Shortly after, Richard called me aside. "Forget about Danny. Going against the people who protect you is professional suicide, and may be literal. Think about what you've achieved." I swallowed hard and ended up denying help to my old friend. Danny seemed disappointed, but didn't insist. A few months later, I heard that the firm where he worked had serious problems and ended up closing. They said Danny had disappeared. I felt a twinge of guilt, but suppressed the feeling. I was more concerned with maintaining my new status. Then things started to get disturbing. I received a phone call in the middle of the night. I answered sleepily. "Hello," from the other end. I heard only heavy breathing, almost like a cloth rubbing against the phone. I repeated "hello" several times, but nothing. I hung up feeling a slight shiver down my neck. The next night, another identical call. Then it started happening almost every day. In parallel, I noticed that in my apartment, doors seemed to creak at dawn. Shadows appeared in the corners of my vision when I was drowsy. I tried to attribute everything to fatigue, but the feeling of being watched grew with each moment. Once I stayed late at the office to draft an appeal. The hallway was empty. The cold fluorescent light flickered intermittently. I swore I heard footsteps echoing on the ceramic floor. I got up to check the rooms, but they were all locked. I returned to my desk, my heart beating fast. Minutes later, I heard it again, something like dragging footsteps. I ran out of there, leaving half the work behind. I told Richard about it the next day, and he laughed, but with a slight tremor in his voice. "You're impressed, Lucas. It's part of the package to feel this weight on your conscience. Relax, you're not alone in this. And if I want to leave it all behind," I ventured. He narrowed his eyes. "It's not that simple. You signed, remember." I remained silent, trying to convince myself that there was nothing supernatural involved. Maybe it was just guilt or paranoia. But deep down, I felt that I had given away something of myself by signing that book. My financial life improved. I won successive cases. It was so fast that I caught the attention of colleagues in other firms. Even so, it took about 2.5 years until I was invited to participate in a selective list to act as a substitute judge in a smaller county. I realized that everything was being orchestrated for my career to take off officially, but at a slightly more credible pace in the eyes of third parties. Although internally, I knew that it was still too fast by real standards. In no time, I began to be invited to major legal events, where I would have coffee alongside people whom, just a year before, I only knew by name. I found myself surrounded by renowned lawyers, prosecutors, and magistrates, who, in a veiled way, were part of the same circle. The conversations were always the same. So-and-so needs a certain favorable ruling. If you can expedite it, everyone wins. I just agreed as if I had no choice. Large deposits began to appear in my account. I bought a new car. My parents were happy, but my father began to ask more direct questions. "Where does all this money come from, son? I know the life of a lawyer or substitute judge doesn't fill the account like this overnight." I gave evasive answers, saying they were bonuses or office agreements. My father didn't seem satisfied, but had no evidence to confront me. The first time something truly macabre happened was on a late afternoon, after I won an extremely delicate criminal case. We represented an influential businessman accused of money laundering. The case against him was robust, but the judge dismissed everything thanks to my negotiation, or rather, my interference in calls with high-ranking people. The following night, I arrived home and found a note under the door. It simply said, "We are satisfied." Continue. There was no signature. The trembling calligraphy left me tense. I looked around the building corridor, but saw no one. Later, the phone rang again, and only breathing could be heard. I hung up, sweating, not knowing if these were threats or demonstrations of power. Over time, my reputation grew to the point where the firm indicated me to join the staff of an important magistrate. It was, in theory, an unbelievable opportunity for someone with so little forensic practice, but not surprising within the system. Still, everything occurred naturally, as if predetermined. I went through shallow formalities, and suddenly I became the right hand of Judge Rosen, a wary man of soft speech. He told me, "I trust you'll be useful here, Lucas. You know how to deal with big shots." I interpreted that as a warning. It wasn't long before I took on delicate functions, reviewing cases, drafting decision minutes, and mainly negotiating sentences. I began to receive notes in brown envelopes that said things like, "Acquit such a name." And at the end, there was always a symbol similar to what I had seen in the black-covered book. The worst part was that Judge Rosen would sign without questioning. We were mere instruments of something greater. This routine consumed me. I had access to cases of homicide, drug trafficking, embezzlement of public funds. In many of them, the evidence was irrefutable, but I was instructed to manipulate the decisions. I got used to it, although each new act sank my conscience deeper into the mire. My mother called me frequently, always concerned about my health. I invented that it was just stress, and she asked me to pray more. My father, on the other hand, was increasingly suspicious. He tried to talk to me in person one night, showing up unexpectedly at my apartment. "Lucas, I'm seeing the changes in your life, and I feel something doesn't add up. You can talk to me, son." I felt a tightness in my chest. I just answered that work was consuming my strength. He pushed a bit. "If something illegal is happening, we can still find a way for you to get out of it." Immediately, I remembered the disappearances, the threats, and also the certainty that my father, as a detective, could put himself in danger. I lied, saying he was seeing problems where there were none. He gave me a worried look. "If something happens, I'll find out. I just ask that you don't forget your values." It was during this time that I began to see in certain places a tall man wearing a dark suit and tie. The guy had a blank expression, but stared at me as if following me. It could be in the courthouse building, on the sidewalk in front of my house, or even in the coffee line. I would look away, and when I looked back for him, he'd be gone. One night, arriving at the courthouse parking lot, I swore I saw him leaning against one of the pillars a few meters from me. When I looked again, there was only the empty pillar. My hands sweated on the steering wheel. I left in a rush. I tried to talk about this with Richard once. "Do you also see a man in a dark suit?" He just laughed, but with a slight tremor in his voice. I've learned to ignore such things. They're part of our commitment, Lucas. That was the kind of comment that made me lose sleep. I spent nights tossing and turning in bed, always tormented by nightmares where I was in a dark courtroom before a faceless judge who pointed a giant gavel at me, slamming it against the desk and shouting, "Guilty." I would wake up sweating, with the distinct feeling that someone was in my room. There were times when I saw through the window reflection a figure standing behind me. When I turned around, the room was empty. If that wasn't enough, after a few more months in this role, I received news that I would be promoted to substitute judge in a civil matters court, with an even faster rise than before. It took less than a year in this advisory position for this to happen. People praised my connections or my intelligence. Behind the curtain, I knew I was nothing more than a puppet moved by invisible puppeteers who made me sign anything. From time to time, I told myself that this was just the price to survive. It was during this phase that I reconnected with a former college classmate, Mariah, a lawyer who at the time was as idealistic as I was. She came into my office to question a case I had judged without reading, harming a defendant in a blatant manner. I remember her looking at me with indignation. "Aren't you even going to examine the evidence?" "That's the basics, Lucas." I tried to justify there are many cases. "I have to trust what I'm told," she huffed. "You weren't like this. What justification will you give your conscience?" Mariah left, slamming the door. I was still trembling with anger and shame when I received a message on my cell phone. "Don't listen to her. Continue to comply." I immediately deleted it. From then on, Mariah began to avoid me, and I heard that she commented in the hallways that I had sold myself to someone. At this point, I could no longer counter what they said. It was true. The months dragged on. More and more cases, more and more orders. I found myself forced to sign sentences that freed drug dealers, murderers, or white-collar thieves. Along with this, money continued to enter my account. Invitations to gala events arrived in profusion, and I was greeted as the promising young magistrate. On the outside, a successful professional; on the inside, a shattered man. Once on a cold night, I received another strange call. I answered and heard a hoarse, almost guttural voice. "Your time will run out, Your Honor." Before I could retort, the line went dead. The presence of the man in the dark suit began to intensify. I saw him almost every day at different points in the city, always motionless, staring at me from afar. I reached the point of asking about him to the courthouse security guards, but no one seemed to have seen him. I went to talk to Richard again, who was now even more powerful and influential. He took me to a reserved room. Through the windows, you could see the movement of cars below, but inside reigned an uncomfortable silence. "Lucas, keep calm. You know that deep down you're benefiting from this whole scheme." "Yes, but I can't stand it anymore, Richard. Those notes, the calls, the apparitions, what is this?" He shrugged. "It's the price. We all pay. If it weren't for this pressure, do you think anyone would stay in line? The point is, you came from nothing and today have a life that few enjoy. Do you think you don't need to pay?" I wanted to scream that I preferred never to have signed that damn book, but I knew it was too late. I left the room with my head dizzy. I began to suffer from a constant headache, and doctors prescribed me tranquilizers. I slept little, always tormented by nightmares where I was in a dark courtroom before a faceless judge. Still, my career continued to advance. In less than a year, I was invited to assume the titular position in a public treasury court. They held a ceremony full of pomp, with speeches and applause. My parents attended, emotional, and my father hugged me. "My son, you deserve it. Continue to be a good man." I smiled awkwardly, feeling that none of it was legitimate. It was on this day that I noticed in the middle of the audience the man in the dark suit, standing. He didn't applaud, he didn't smile, he just watched me. When I blinked, he disappeared. The next few weeks were a torment. Entire boxes of cases came to me, each with explicit instructions on how to judge. Sometimes I'd risk contesting, but the evidence says otherwise, and someone would interrupt me. "You're not here to discuss the evidence." I obeyed, signing sentences according to orders that came from above. I began to feel like a mere human stamp. But what really shook my foundations was a specific case involving a criminal organization accused of kidnappings and murders. The documentation was so dense that I took several nights to read it all, even against my will. There were recordings, testimonies, photos of victims. I couldn't ignore the barbarism. But at the top of the cover was a message: acquit. Interested parties demand quick solution. That was the sentence I was ordered to give. When the representative of this organization appeared in my office, he looked at me with a confident smile. With few gestures, he bribed officials, controlled the environment. Trembling, I thought of resisting, but could only remember the constant threats hanging over me. I ended up signing the acquittal. As I set the pen on the desk, I felt a chill run down my spine. I was complicit with people capable of unimaginable atrocities. I arrived home late and found a gift at the entrance, a black box wrapped in gold paper. I opened it carefully and found a small decorative dagger with a rusty blade and an ornate handle. With it was a short note: "Now you're part of us." I closed the box, nauseated. It was as if they wanted to show me that I was indeed in the same boat as dangerous criminals. I threw the box in a corner of the closet. That dawn, I couldn't close my eyes. The lamplight flickered, and I swore I heard footsteps outside my apartment, as if someone were walking in the corridor and putting their ear to the door. My father continued trying to talk to me, but I avoided his calls. One of the times he insisted, someone anonymously sent a threatening message to his cell phone, saying, "Don't get involved in matters you don't understand." He tried to question me, but I just begged him to trust me. I was afraid of any investigation he might initiate, because I knew it was all tied to very powerful people. At the court, I met some magistrates in a similar situation, with faces of exhaustion. One of them, older, had a nervous breakdown in the middle of a hearing, shouting, "They're everywhere. I can't take it anymore." He was restrained, and days later, they announced his retirement due to health problems. No one spoke openly about corruption or agreements. Everyone pretended everything was fine. I knew that man had been removed from the path, so as not to disrupt things. The subtle threats continued. Whenever I thought about refusing some procedure, a new note would appear, a photo of me, or some message on my cell phone. "Don't forget who pays your bills." And I remained obedient. I had no idea how to get out of that vicious circle, or even if there was a way out. The height of the nightmare happened when I received an invitation to a special meeting at an old estate on the outskirts of Boston. I was informed that it would be a kind of ceremony to renew ties. The invitation was irrefusable. I drove on a winding road lined with tall trees that looked like ghosts in the dark. Upon arrival, I parked near other luxury cars. There were armed security guards, all wearing black suits. I crossed a large courtyard to a hall lit by old lanterns. Inside, I recognized many faces: magistrates, prosecutors, wealthy businessmen. Some I had already seen at lunches or exclusive parties. The air had a sweet odor, perhaps from some strong incense. I felt a twinge of headache. The same elderly man with gray hair who had extended the pen to me months ago appeared at the front of the hall. He announced that he would renew the pacts made previously and introduce new members. There was no exaggeratedly supernatural ritual, but the atmosphere was heavy. Some younger lawyers, trembling, signed the black-covered book. Then they were led to a corner where they exchanged low words with high-ranking people. I looked at each face, perceiving fear and greed. Then the elderly man called me by name, bringing the golden pen once again. "Reaffirm, Judge. Show your commitment." My lips were dry. The entire hall seemed to be watching me, including the man in the dark suit, standing at the back without mixing with the others. I thought about refusing, but remembered how Danny had disappeared, how the other magistrate had been removed. I also remembered the macabre gifts, the phone calls. With my heart pounding, I signed. The moment was quick, but I felt as if my soul was suffocating. Some participants gave discreet applause. The man in the dark suit displayed an almost imperceptible smile. Then the meeting ended with toasts and conversations about future projects. No one spoke directly about crimes, but everything sounded so indecent that I barely remained standing. I returned to the city with the feeling of having crossed an even darker door than before. Upon reaching my apartment, I found the door unlocked, although I was sure I had locked it before leaving. Inside, nothing was missing, but there was a new note on my work desk. "We are here." Always, at that moment, I felt physically ill. I had bouts of nausea. I tried to pray, but realized the words made no sense in my mouth. After that, my nights became a constant torment. The phone would ring punctually around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I would hear that sinister breathing. I began to see shapes in the reflection of the turned-off TV. I developed the habit of not looking too long at mirrors, because sometimes I'd see my own reflection smile differently than me, as if delayed in reacting. I attributed part of this to stress, but I couldn't completely ignore it, especially with the more frightening occurrence that came next. I received a new voluminous case involving high-ranking politicians accused of abhorrent crimes. There were videos and detailed testimonies. Even so, the order was simple: acquit all. I trembled while reading those pages, aware that these people were capable of eliminating anyone who opposed them. I stamped the file, signed with my pen, and closed the case with trembling hands. The feeling of repulsion was uncontrollable. Minutes later, I checked my cell phone and found congratulatory messages. "You are guaranteeing our stability. Your bank account will thank you." I threw the cell phone on the table. My throat was dry. I ran my tongue over my lips to try to moisten them. I needed to talk to someone, but I had no one to turn to. I had completely isolated myself, no longer meeting college colleagues except those already involved in the scheme. I barely saw my parents. Guilt consumed me, but fear kept me quiet. One day, I couldn't take the pressure anymore. I wanted to write down everything I knew, leave a testament, and disappear. I spent the night awake. When I picked up a pen to write something in an old notebook, I noticed my hand was shaking so much that I could barely form letters. My eyes filled with tears. I asked myself at what moment everything had started to go wrong. Was it at the first signature? Was it at the first omission? However, with each sentence I tried to scribble, my mind projected the faces of powerful people, threats, blackmail, the presence of that man in the dark suit. A wave of nausea overwhelmed me. I tore up the sheets and threw them in the trash. Cowardice spoke louder. I continued living in this state of torpor. I received more corrupted cases, more obscure favors, more gifts like designer watches, invitations to expensive events, and even trips that pretended to be legal congresses. But I knew I wasn't free to simply enjoy these luxuries. With each bite of a canapé, a voice in my head repeated, "You sold yourself." With each toast, I remembered the victims I had condemned or left without justice. The nightmares reached a point where they made me wake up screaming. One dawn, I opened my eyes, panting, and saw in the darkness a figure at my bedroom door. I shouted, "Who's there?" But the figure vanished in the same instant. My cell phone rang. It was again an unknown number. I answered and a voice whispered, "You know whose house this is, Judge." I hung up, trembling. I could no longer distinguish between hallucination and reality, but I was sure someone was watching me. Sometime later, a rumor emerged that independent journalists were thoroughly investigating corruption in the judiciary. There was talk of a dossier and recordings that could bring down many heads. This rumor made the secret meetings become even more frequent and vigilant. I received direct messages ordering caution and discretion, always with that phrase, "Don't commit treason." I wondered if there was any chance of denouncing everything, but deep down, I knew that any movement in this direction could cost my life or the lives of my parents. The system I was inserted into wasn't made up just of important people. There was something bigger, something I didn't understand, but that terrified me, as if a silent network of surveillance and blackmail hung over all of us. And in my case, a sinister enigma also hung. That man in the dark suit, the voices, the shadows. I write this confession not to obtain pity from whoever reads it. I know I am guilty. I simply cannot bear the hypocrisy of pretending not to see the evil I helped spread. I continue occupying my position, pretending to serve the law. Yet behind the scenes, I receive phone calls, orders, and occasionally repugnant gifts that symbolize my servitude. With each signature I give, I feel a part of me dies. I hope that if someone finds these pages, they might at least understand that it's not so simple to slam the door and walk out. These people or forces, for I no longer know what they are, wouldn't let me go easily. I'm entangled in threats, in secrets, in something that transcends common logic. My nightmares, my headaches, and my visions tell me there's something beyond the human in this scheme, but nobody dares speak of it clearly. Do I regret it? Every day. If I could turn back time, I would never have signed anything. But the moment I put my signature on that black-covered book, I lost control of my destiny. Not even the bravest man could fight against such a well-armed system. And even if he did, he would pay the price with his own life, or worse. Each night, lying in my bed, I face the darkness and feel the presence of someone in the room. Sometimes I think I hear my father repeating, "An honest man doesn't sell himself, Lucas." Other times, I hear the dragging voice on the phone that seems to mock my anguish. And above all, I feel that any hour I'll have to face a true judgment, a judgment that isn't limited to the law of men, but will charge me for what I've done with no right to appeal or higher court. If that day comes, perhaps I'll be just a shadow of the idealistic young man I was in my youth, that young man who believed in justice, who admired his upright father and devout mother. At this point, I'm just a puppet of an invisible power. My anguish grows, but all I can do is continue signing, continue pretending. It's the only way not to be swallowed completely by this darkness. As I finish this text, I feel the air in the room grow heavy. I hear footsteps in the hallway, and the clock on the wall marks exactly 3 in the morning. It's always at this hour that strange things become more intense. Now my cell phone vibrates without showing who's calling. I don't answer, but I know it's the same swampy breathing on the other end of the line. If you've read this far, understand that there is much that is horrible in the world that hides beneath us. No one is completely safe when justice becomes a product for sale. As for me, I don't expect forgiveness. I just felt that I needed to at least once scream the truth, even if it's into the void. Yes, I am guilty. And if one day I disappear, as happened with others who tried to leave the scheme, know that I accepted my fate from the moment I signed what I shouldn't have. It may seem like an exaggeration, but it isn't. There's something much bigger at stake, something that I suspect goes beyond the earthly plane. I remain here, trapped in a machine that devours me bit by bit. And every night I remember my father's words, "An honest man doesn't sell himself." Unfortunately, I ignored them, and that's the greatest horror one can carry in their soul. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to be alerted to all future narrations. I upload new videos every day. Hope to see you in the next ones. I'll leave 2 other good videos on screen that I know you'll enjoy. See you there. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hannah, and I was born in a place many of you might not know. A small town in rural Montana called Pinewood Creek. I grew up watching my mother sweep our wooden porch and my father tend to the chickens in our backyard. Each house there was separated by white picket fences that had long since weathered to gray. And children played in the streets without fear, even when the summer sun beat down mercilessly on us. We lived simply but happily. Neighbors would gather for Sunday potlucks at the local church. The 4th of July parade would pass through town every summer, and the fall harvest festival would fill the town square with laughter and music. I felt protected, surrounded by the certainty that nothing bad could ever happen. But everything changed when I turned 17. My parents were involved in an accident on the winding mountain road that connected Pinewood Creek to the neighboring town of Riverdale. It was a snowy winter night, and I stayed home, anxiously checking the clock as the hours passed. I remember pacing by the window, my breath fogging the glass, until the sheriff's car pulled up to our driveway. Their truck had slid off the road while avoiding a logging vehicle, and there were no survivors. In an instant, that feeling of protection I'd always had shattered. For the first time, I understood how brutal the world could be. The only person I could turn to was my Aunt Claire, who lived in a moderately sized city called Lakeside, about 3 hours away. She was my mother's younger sister, a woman with tired eyes but affectionate words. Despite having a modest apartment, she immediately offered to take me in. I went to her with a suitcase of clothes and a heart full of tears that I unsuccessfully tried to hide. When I arrived in Lakeside, I realized everything there was different paved streets, buses circulating, people rushing to and from work. Aunt Claire's apartment was in a working-class neighborhood, with walls painted a pale yellow and a small balcony where she grew herbs in terra-cotta pots. She welcomed me with a long embrace that made me feel a little of the family warmth I had lost. "Honey, from today on, this is your home," said Aunt Claire, pulling me inside. The interior was simple. The linoleum floor creaked slightly when we walked. The kitchen had an old electric stove, and in the living room there were framed photographs scattered on shelves. A painting of a mountain landscape dominated the main wall. Aunt Claire was married to Victor, a man in his early 60s who had worked almost his entire life in the trucking industry. I had never met him before, as he had been estranged from our family for many years. When I met him, I felt a chill run down my spine. His handshake was firm, but conveyed none of the affection that my aunt had shown. "Welcome, kid. I hope you know how to behave and help with expenses," was what he said bluntly on the first day. Still dazed by the loss of my parents, I just nodded in agreement. Inside me, a mixture of grief, fear, and insecurity made me want to curl up in a corner and stay quiet forever. In the first few days, Aunt Claire showed me the routine of the house. I helped with the cleaning, learned how to cook her special beef stew, and figured out how to operate the ancient washing machine in the basement. Simple tasks, but they occupied my mind, distancing me from the pain. However, it didn't take long for Victor's presence to become oppressive. He was a controlled and controlling man, if that's possible. He was always checking the water bills, electricity bills, anything that could reduce his money. He liked to know how much groceries we used per week, how much laundry detergent went into each load. Sometimes I caught him peeking through the door crack to see if we weren't using too much electricity. And when he wasn't home, he was out chasing trucking contracts, talking to dispatchers, or pursuing any deal that might yield him some profit. "Claire, better teach this girl to value what she has. I don't want waste," he would always repeat. It was almost like a curfew warning. Every time we heard that phrase, we knew something that day had left him dissatisfied. I did my best not to be a burden. I watched Aunt Claire trying to smooth things over with a tense smile on her lips. "Take it easy, Victor. She just lost her parents. She needs time." He would give her a look that mixed impatience and distrust, but wouldn't say anything more. He would remain silent, fiddling with his budget papers, before climbing the stairs to the bedroom he shared with my aunt. Sometimes I tried to imagine what my life would have been like if my parents were still alive. I would have stayed in Pinewood Creek, studying at the same school, hanging out with friends at the local diner. But now reality was Lakeside, this apartment where a hard-tempered man subjected us to increasingly rigid rules. To contribute to expenses, I decided to look for work. I got a job at a nearby construction site, helping the office manager with paperwork. It was menial work, but it paid enough for me to buy some groceries and occasionally help Aunt Claire with the gas or water bill. I left home early, just before 6 in the morning, took a bus to the construction site, and returned late in the afternoon with my back aching from sitting in an uncomfortable chair all day. One day after my shift, I came home and found my aunt collapsed on the kitchen floor. She was shaking and sweating profusely. I rushed to her, trying to help her up. Fortunately, she came to and sat leaning against the refrigerator. "What happened, Aunt Claire?" I asked in panic. She took several seconds to respond. "I don't know, Hannah. I think I had a bad dizzy spell. I've been feeling strange for some time now." I tried to convince her to go to the neighborhood clinic, but she hesitated, saying she didn't want to worry Victor. When he arrived later, I told him what had happened. He just shrugged. "No point wasting money on nonsense. If she's alive, she's fine. I'll schedule a doctor's appointment later, but let's not exaggerate." That infuriated me. If she's alive, she's fine. Deep down, I noticed that Victor seemed uneasy whenever medication, doctors, or hospital expenses were mentioned. Something didn't add up, but I tried not to feed paranoia. Maybe it was just a lack of empathy on his part. In the days that followed, Aunt Claire had other similar episodes. She seemed increasingly weak. Sometimes I noticed bruises on her arms and legs, without her having bumped into anything. During a conversation with our neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, I heard a comment that put me on alert. "Did you know that your uncle took out one of those life insurance policies? You know, when one person dies, the other gets a bundle. Seems like he had done this before marrying your aunt," Mrs. Peterson said with a suspicious look. My heart raced. So there was this life insurance policy, and it was probably worth a considerable amount. I started paying attention to every gesture Victor made, every sentence pronounced dryly, every time he looked at my aunt with disdain. Something else bothered me. Aunt Claire was already taking some medications prescribed by her longtime doctor, Dr. Roberts, but I suspected that the doses weren't being given correctly. Once I found a small notebook of Victor's hidden in a drawer. It contained the name of the medication my aunt needed to take, along with scribbled notes about quantities, all below what the official prescription determined. It was as if someone was deliberately adjusting the doses so they wouldn't have the expected effect. I started checking the bottles and noticed discrepancies in the administration times. In a quick conversation with my aunt, she said that Victor wouldn't allow her to abuse the medications, claiming everything was expensive and that it wasn't always worth completing the treatment rigorously. He says I should take as little as possible to avoid leaving us without money. But if the doctor ordered more, why can't I? She asked me in a dejected tone. I didn't answer anything. Inside, anger only grew. I watched Aunt Claire waste away, without being able to truly protect her. One night, I overheard an argument between them. She wanted to go to a follow-up appointment with Dr. Roberts, but Victor refused to pay for the consultation. "You think money grows on trees," he shouted. "It's my health, Victor," Aunt Claire retorted with a choked voice. "With health or without it, you're not going to bankrupt me." That hurt me more than I could bear. I went to my room and tried to think of solutions. If I could, I would have already taken my aunt far away from that man. But I had no money or means to support myself, let alone sustain someone else's health. Crying, I realized that I was trapped in a cycle of fear, and Aunt Claire was too. We needed help. That's when I remembered Rose, a woman known in the neighborhood for working as a herbalist. My mother had spoken about her before she died. They said Rose, despite not being a nurse or doctor, understood a bit about natural cures, teas, baths, and remedies to ward off illness. It wasn't something I completely believed in, but my situation was so desperate that I decided to give it a chance. I arranged to meet her on the weekend, at a time when Victor would be out. Child, God writes straight with crooked lines, but sometimes we need to give a little push, Rose said as soon as I told her what was happening. Do you think there's some herb or something that could help Aunt Claire? I asked hopefully. Herbal remedies, healing rituals, all this can alleviate symptoms, but if this man is harming her, maybe you need to be more assertive. She then lowered her voice as if fearing the walls had ears. There's a way to remove those who harm us from our path, but it's not for everyone. It's not always advisable, and if you follow this path, you'll carry the weight for the rest of your life. What do you mean? I questioned uneasily. Sometimes the justice of the world doesn't arrive, and when it doesn't, some people appeal to the justice that lies between the earthly and the sacred. I left there with my head spinning. I didn't want to think about taking anyone's life, but just imagining that Victor could be deliberately sabotaging Aunt Claire's health to receive dirty money made me nauseous. During the following week, I returned to my routine at the construction office, but with each file I filed, I reflected on the situation. Would I be capable of doing something against the man who had given me shelter, even if he was a tyrant? The last straw happened on a silent night. I had come home from work exhausted and went straight to my room, but I heard a strange noise from my aunt's bedroom. It sounded like a moan of pain. I opened the door and found Victor pressing her arm against the bed. She was trying to break free, but couldn't. I had the impression that he was injecting something or removing some medicine. It all happened very quickly. When I approached, he pretended he was just fixing her pillow. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to sound firm, but my voice barely came out. "Taking care of what's mine." "Go to your room and don't interfere," he retorted with a fierce look. Aunt Claire was crying, and I knelt beside the bed, touching her sweaty hands. He left, slamming the door forcefully. Fear and indignation took over me. She was trembling. It was there that I decided I needed to act definitively. The next day, I disguised my anxiety as much as possible, so no one would notice. Victor left to take care of some business, and I took advantage and returned to Rose's house. I knocked on the door without knowing exactly what to ask for. "You know that what you're asking is not simple. This is not a game," she said, looking deep into my eyes. "I'm aware, but there's no other way out. He's going to kill my aunt little by little." She handed me a small package of ground herbs and explained how to prepare a tea that, if mixed with some alcoholic beverage, could cause severe poisoning over days or weeks. The idea was to give Victor a daily dose of the preparation without him noticing, so no one would suspect a sudden event. At that moment, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. "If you do this, there's no turning back, Hannah," Rose warned. "If I don't, my aunt will die, and he'll go unpunished," I replied, my eyes burning. I returned home with the package well hidden in my bag. During dinner, I observed Victor serving himself whiskey, as he did every night. He had the habit of drinking until late, alone or beside some friend who occasionally appeared. However, that night he stayed on the porch, watching the street movement. "Did you clean the house today?" he asked suddenly. "Yes, sir," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "And your aunt is sleeping." He stared at me with a suspicious look. "She's resting, but very weak. We need to take her to the doctor," I risked once more. "I've already said we don't have money for superfluous expenses." "Don't insist." He took the glass of whiskey to his lips, drank it all at once, and made a face as if savoring the cheap alcohol. My heart accelerated. I felt that if I did nothing, Aunt Claire wouldn't hold on for much longer. I waited for him to go into the living room and leave the bottle on the center table. That would be the perfect moment to put the plan into action. With cautious steps, I went to the kitchen, opened the little package of herbs, and took out a small amount as Rose had instructed. I returned to the living room, ensuring that Victor was entertained with the news on TV. He didn't like excessive lights on, so everything was in dim light. I poured the powder into the bottle, stirring gently to make no noise. I felt a chill down my spine. In less than a minute, I was back in the kitchen, storing the rest of the package as if nothing had happened. That night was long. I locked myself in my room, but didn't sleep a wink. A mix of guilt and determination consumed me. I remembered my parents, how they had always taught me to have respect for life. But at the same time, I recalled the memory of Aunt Claire's suffering. In self-defense, I decided I wouldn't back down. In the days that followed, I noticed that Victor drank the tampered whiskey without noticing any difference. He continued with his hostile behavior, but after a week, he began to complain of stomach pains. He attributed it to stress or poorly made food, throwing indirect accusations at me. I, in silence, continued preparing dinner, cleaning the house, and ensuring that my aunt took the correct medication dosage when Victor wasn't watching. He began to have coughing fits and nausea that left him weak, but he didn't give up the bottle. His business dealings were set aside because his health prevented him from moving around much. This irritated him. He vented his frustration on me and Aunt Claire. Only now I had more courage to face him, because I knew each dose weakened him. "I don't know what's happening to me, girl. It's like death is following me," he confided one night, leaning against the corridor wall. "Death follows all of us, but some invite it to arrive faster," I responded without averting my gaze. He furrowed his brow as if noticing the harshness of my response, but said nothing. He entered the room, staggering. A few hours later, I heard noises in the kitchen. I went downstairs and found him vomiting in the sink, trying to hold onto the counter. "What are you looking at?" "Go to sleep," he shouted with a choked voice. The strong smell of bile mixed with whiskey invaded the environment. I returned to my room and closed the door, feeling a knot in my stomach. I was no longer sure if I could bear that scene. A man who, no matter how despicable, was still breathing and fighting. But it was enough to remember Aunt Claire's sickly face to convince me there was no alternative. The weeks passed, and Victor deteriorated visibly. He became paler and complained of dizziness. Even so, he refused medical help, which seemed a cruel irony considering everything he had done against my aunt's health. One afternoon, I visited Rose to tell her how things were going. "Girl, stay firm, but don't forget that the burden you carry won't go away," she commented, finishing preparing a chamomile tea for another person waiting in the living room. I returned home in the early evening. Upon arriving, I found Aunt Claire more animated than usual. Surprised, I asked if everything was okay. She said that thanks to a neighbor who had taken her to a free clinic consultation, she had managed to get new medications and was feeling a little more energetic. "It's a blessing, honey." The doctor examined me and increased the dose of some pills. "Victor doesn't even know properly." I asked Mrs. Peterson to accompany me without fanfare. I was relieved. Each day, Aunt Claire showed small signs of improvement, and curiously, it was as if all the vitality she regained was drained from Victor. The house that once seemed shrouded in morbid silence now had small glimpses of hope. On a Saturday night, around 8 o'clock, I heard a dull thud coming from the couple's bedroom. I ran to see what it was, and found Victor fallen beside the bed, with a sweaty face and labored breathing. Aunt Claire, frightened, was trying to help him up. "Leave me alone, Claire," he growled, pushing her away with a weak slap. "He can't continue like this anymore." "I'm going to call for help, Aunt." I picked up the landline phone that was on the small table in the living room. Victor tried to object, but he was too weak. The ambulance came, took about 40 minutes to arrive, and took him, still alive, to the city hospital. Aunt Claire and I went right after, in a car provided by the neighbor. On the way, I felt a pang of regret. I shouldn't have let him suffer so much. Then I remembered the times I saw him manipulating my aunt's medications, the terror we lived in, and the guilt diminished but didn't disappear. At the hospital, doctors ran tests and admitted him in serious condition. They tried to understand the cause of so much organ failure. A combination of alcohol, possible intoxications, and neglect led to irreversible deterioration. I paid attention to every word they said in the corridor, apprehensive, but convinced that my role was to protect my aunt. And at that exact moment, I was also trying to protect myself from any suspicion. He held on for 2 more weeks. During this period, we couldn't visit him often because the hospital had restrictions. And honestly, Aunt Claire didn't have the spirit to face him. It was in the early morning, from a Friday to Saturday, that the call came. Victor had died. A massive heart attack, they said. After the funeral, life in Lakeside underwent an almost immediate change. Without Victor's oppressive presence, the apartment gained a lightness that I hadn't felt since I arrived. Aunt Claire, now a widow, was able to organize her own medical exams and take the medications according to what the doctor recommended. We then discovered there was indeed a life insurance policy in her name, yes, but not as substantial as had been rumored. In any case, that money belonged to her and could help with her treatment. She was shocked to realize that perhaps her own husband wanted her to die before him, to receive the insurance in reverse. We'll never know all the details of the plans he was making. Some people in the neighborhood commented that Victor's death was strange. There were those who said that stress or excessive drinking consumed him. Others believed in bad luck because they knew he had been mistreating his own wife. No one ever directly mentioned that I might have helped cause his death. I maintained a discreet posture, taking care of Aunt Claire and returning to work at the construction office. Everything followed its flow. I started frequenting Rose's house only to thank her and ask her to pray for my aunt's health. She would give me an understanding look, as if she knew the torments that sometimes haunted me at night. There are days when I feel a deep guilt for everything that happened. At other times, I have the conviction that I saved an innocent person's life. It's strange to walk this border between right and wrong. Even today, when I see Aunt Claire recovering, cooking her special stew, and smiling while helping me fold clothes, I feel that I did what was necessary. Gradually, our home filled with a warmth that I thought I would never feel again after my parents' death. Pinewood Creek remained behind as a childhood memory, but I still carry within me the mornings I spent on its dirt roads, the warm breeze of late afternoon, and the bird songs that echoed through the yard. Lakeside became my second chance. Here I rebuilt bonds, learned about courage, and discovered that sometimes justice and vengeance can mix in a way that we can't always separate. Today, as I write these lines, I hear Aunt Claire humming an old country song in the kitchen. She became a widow, and although she kept a silent mourning for Victor, little by little, she's regaining her will to live. I, on the other hand, carry a secret that I don't tell anyone. Only God and perhaps Rose know the whole story, and even if most of the neighborhood knew, they would probably approve. It's impossible to say. What I can affirm is that faced with fear and injustice, I was forced to do what I did. I'm not proud, but I don't regret it. Protecting those we love in the end is also an act of survival. Before we continue, I want to emphasize that I have only two channels: Evoking Fear and The Gift, Tales of Terror. Any other channel that isn't one of these two is just someone pretending to be me to discredit my work. Thank you for your understanding, friends. Let's continue. Good evening, folks. My name is Ethan, and I grew up in an old Victorian house in the historic district of Salem, Massachusetts. The towering structure with its intricate woodwork and weathered shingles had been in our family for generations, a silent witness to countless secrets. My father, Richard, was a man of commanding presence with piercing eyes and a demeanor that always demanded respect or fear, depending on your perspective. My mother, Eleanor, possessed a natural sweetness that won everyone over. She dedicated her mornings to household chores, and in the afternoons, she baked pastries she sold from a small window at the front of our house, a quaint tradition she'd maintained for years. The aroma of apple pies and cinnamon rolls would drift through the neighborhood, drawing people to our doorstep. I always saw her with a smile, though behind her eyes, one could detect an ancient weariness. As time passed, I began to notice that my parents' marriage was founded on interests that were never entirely clear to me. Through whispered family conversations, I learned that my mother's family had wealth. The Victorian house we lived in, for instance, belonged to her side. My father, on the other hand, came from much humbler beginnings. They said he was a former semi-professional baseball player, known throughout New England for hitting game-winning home runs in local tournaments, which gave him a certain standing in the community. But at home, he was distant and controlling. His commands always came as imperatives. "Ethan, don't you think you should reconsider those friends?" Or, "Alina, if you continue spending money on these expensive ingredients, you know what the consequence will be." They weren't shouts, but dry assertions that left no room for debate. If I tried to argue, he would silence me with a single look that froze my insides. I often wondered how my mother could bear living in such a stifling atmosphere. But she never complained, burying her emotions in work and maternal care. From this relationship, besides me, my sister Lily was born 3 years younger. We both grew up attuned to the nuances of our father's gaze and the tensions that filled the air. The house was immense, a typical New England Victorian with thick walls, wooden windows painted a deep green, and an interior courtyard with a small garden where my mother grew herbs like mint, rosemary, and basil for her recipes. The setting had a certain historical charm, but the family atmosphere was never as harmonious as Salem's beautiful facades might suggest. At night, I would often hear muffled conversations coming from the kitchen or my parents' bedroom. Sometimes I'd catch Lily peeking through the door cracks. Whenever she called me to see or hear something, I refused, afraid of witnessing any conflict. As the years went by, I learned to read the silent language of my parents. Like Lily, I could sense when a delicate subject was about to arise. My father spoke little, but when he did, there was an implicit law that could not be challenged. My mother, in contrast, was the embodiment of affection, but seemed to always walk on eggshells, as if any misstep could displease her husband. The truth is, even in childhood, I sensed that something deeper was at play in that dynamic. Family secrets, silent contracts, and old agreements that no one was willing to explain openly. When I turned 18, I was accepted to study American history at Salem State University. Although it wasn't as prestigious as law or engineering, I loved studying the past, especially the region's history, filled with legends and narratives intertwined with America's own story. It was at college that I met Hannah, a classmate studying English literature who, like me, was fascinated by the old buildings, the historic homes, and the colonial churches scattered throughout the city. We met in an elective course that combined regional history and literature. What first caught my attention was her unassuming manner, always ready to listen to what others had to say without judgment. She had a gentle way of talking, a look that seemed to say, "I'm here for whatever you need." While my father was tense and inflexible, Hannah brought a sense of comfort that I had only experienced through my mother. Soon we began taking walks along the cobblestone streets, admiring the colonial facades, and visiting museums and churches on weekends. I would talk about history, and she about literature. Before long, we became inseparable. On the rare occasions when I brought her to meet my family, she was warmly received by my mother and Lily. But my father maintained that look of someone meticulously evaluating us. He no longer played baseball, but kept an imposing physical presence and continued to command attention through his tone of voice and posture. One Saturday afternoon, near the end of my college years, I gathered the courage to formally introduce Hannah to my family. Deep down, I knew my mother would support her, but I wasn't so sure about my father's reaction. So I organized a lunch. My mother outdid herself by preparing roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and corn bread, a traditional New England feast. Lily helped with the dishes, while Hannah and I set the table in the interior courtyard, decorated with freshly picked flowers from the garden. The meeting started well. My mother was immediately charmed by Hannah, exchanging recipes and stories about local treats. My sister was more reserved, but gradually started conversations about music, TV shows, and college assignments. Only my father remained silent for almost the entire time, asking pointed questions. Which town are you from again? Or what do your parents do for a living? Each of Hannah's answers seemed to be dissected by him, who after long silences would nod in approval or emit a brief grunt that showed no sympathy whatsoever. Despite this atmosphere, Hannah, gentle as always, smiled at the end, said goodbye to everyone, and thanked them for lunch. I convinced myself that over time, my father would come to accept her. However, the following weeks showed that this adaptation would be difficult. One day, talking with Hannah, I discovered that she came from a moderately well-off family. Her father, Nathan, owned a business in Boston and had some political connections. Her mother, Charlotte, had passed away when Hannah was still a teenager. Her relationship with her father had been distant ever since, though she maintained a good relationship with a maternal aunt who lived in New York. Hannah explained that she lived alone in Salem because of her studies and tried to support herself with internships and scholarships without much help from her father. My family, well, it's just my father and me in contact, but he's always traveling. There's not much closeness. Maybe I'm looking for a home I never had, she said melancholically one late afternoon as we walked through the Salem Common. Determined to solidify our union, I proposed to Hannah at the end of my course. Shortly after graduating in history, she would complete her English literature degree at the end of the same year. We planned to start our lives together in a rented house, a few blocks from mine, still in the historic district, so that I could help my mother and watch Lily grow up. When I announced my plans to my family, my mother reacted with joy. Son, if that's what you want, count on me for whatever you need. I adore Hannah. She has a good heart, she said, already dreaming about the celebration and preparations. Lily thought the idea was great and gave me a hug, but my father remained cold. He avoided looking me in the eyes and then dropped a phrase that really bothered me. This girl is not for you. Think carefully before making a permanent mistake. I didn't understand why he had such contempt. At first, I thought it might be silly jealousy or simple conservatism, since Hannah lived alone and didn't depend on her family. I stood firm in my decision, because it made no sense to give up such sincere love due to unfounded opinions. As the wedding date approached, I went to Boston to visit Hannah's father. Nathan received me in a spacious apartment, in a luxury building in the Back Bay neighborhood. He was a stern man, but tried to be courteous. He questioned me about my professional plans and emphasized the importance of maintaining family order. A woman needs to know how to respect certain traditions, he said, while leafing through a business magazine. Above all, she must preserve a stable environment. I noticed something strange in his tone. He seemed to want to emphasize that Hannah had obligations to fulfill. He insisted on reminding me that the family name should be honored. I felt uncomfortable and intrigued at the same time. When I returned to Salem, I mentioned the matter to my mother, who reacted with apprehension. Ethan, your father also has fixed ideas about family and home. Maybe they're similar in that regard. Don't let rigid opinions destroy what you're building, she advised. Hannah and I decided to rent the house where we intended to live after the wedding. She was enthusiastic about decorating it with New England inspirations, using rustic furniture and antique items, while I dedicated myself to setting up a small library, as I always wanted a corner for my history books. Curiously, there was a moment when Hannah insisted that I move in before the wedding. A few days later, however, she reaffirmed that due to personal convictions, she didn't think it was right for us to live together before making the union official. This contradiction began to confuse me. When I asked if there was a problem, she would change the subject. It's just my own stuff. I'm trying to reconcile it with what I believe, that's all. I decided to respect her space, but internally I began to question the reason for so much ambiguity. In another episode, I saw Hannah making expensive purchases in high-end stores, something that greatly contrasted with the frugal discourse she maintained. At first, I didn't confront her, as I didn't want to seem invasive. However, each attitude of hers that deviated from the usual pattern made a seed of doubt grow within me. Meanwhile, my mother began to feel constant fatigue. She could no longer produce the daily pastries without rest intervals. Lily, in turn, started complaining of body pains, mainly in her legs and back. We went to the city's health clinic, but routine tests showed no significant changes. The doctors said it could be stress or a passing virus. However, the condition didn't improve. Worried, my mother decided to consult Mrs. Jenkins, a famous healer in Salem known for her blessings and healing prayers that mixed Christian prayers with elements of folk magic. Mrs. Jenkins lived in a discreet cottage filled with hanging herbs and candles in an illuminated oratory. After examining my mother, she simply said, "There's something heavy surrounding your home. There's a lack of clarity, and people are getting sick along with the house. You need protection and faith, Alina." Those words, spoken with such serenity, generated a wave of unease. My mother began to follow Mrs. Jenkins' recommendations, such as sprinkling herb-infused water in the corners of the house and lighting white candles every night. Despite this, the malaise continued in both her and Lily. Meanwhile, my father displayed an even more reserved behavior. When Hannah appeared for a quick visit, he would just greet her with a nod and sometimes cast intense glances, as if he wanted to say something that never materialized into words. There was a dinner where we all sat at the table, and my father initiated an uncomfortable conversation. There are agreements that aren't always spoken. Some things come from the past, he said, looking at Hannah, and what's from the past tends to influence the present in ways people ignore. No one understood exactly what he meant. My mother, sensing the bad atmosphere, changed the subject. Lily remained silent while Hannah lowered her head, seeming uncomfortable. I was already tired of these insinuations, but out of respect for my mother, I avoided confronting him there in front of everyone. A few days later, returning from college where I was preparing to start an internship, I found Lily nervous in her room. She told me she had heard our father arguing with Hannah in the upstairs hallway. She said she couldn't hear every word, but noticed that the topic had to do with old secrets and things that shouldn't be revealed. When Lily tried to get closer, the sound of voices suddenly ceased, and she saw my father coming down the stairs with a face of contained anger. As time passed, a veil of uncertainty hung over me. My sick mother and sister, my increasingly enigmatic father, Hannah acting contradictorily. There were too many loose pieces of a puzzle. I decided to talk to some neighbors who discreetly confirmed having seen Hannah frequenting expensive places where wealthier people usually meet. They also said that on several occasions, my father had been seen leaving late at night, heading towards the bus station or less busy streets. I don't know if it was just an impression, but he seemed to be accompanied, commented an elderly lady who lived across from our house. He doesn't like to be seen, always looking over his shoulder if someone appears, added another neighbor. In parallel, Hannah began to show herself increasingly reclusive. Sometimes she refused my invitations to watch the sunset from the viewpoint. At other times, she said she had urgent work or meetings that prevented her from participating in the wedding preparations. With the date approaching, I began to doubt if everything would unfold the way I had imagined. One day, I mustered the courage to speak directly with her in our rented house, where she kept some of her belongings. I asked about her expenses, about going to expensive places, and even about the conversation she had with my father. I hoped that in the privacy of that environment, she would open up to me. "Ethan, don't pressure me. There's a lot you don't understand. Our love is real, but I need you to trust me," she said with a trembling voice. "If there's something I don't understand, you need to explain it to me. I'm lost amid these contradictions, and I still have to deal with my father's hostility." "I need answers," I retorted, already feeling anger rise to my throat. She, however, remained silent for long seconds, then merely repeated, "Trust me." I left there even more anguished. It seemed that the more I tried to seek clarity, the more charged the environment became, and my increasingly ill mother started showing feverish symptoms without an apparent cause. Her debility became obvious. Lily was also affected, with dizziness and an indisposition that forced her to miss classes. My father, on the other hand, remained strangely active, as if all that tension gave him more energy to continue his nightly commitments. Mrs. Jenkins, the healer, began visiting our house more frequently. She would pray in each room, bless people, and burn herbs to purify the air. On one of these occasions, she called me aside and said, "There are deep layers of secrecy here. There's something dark in the intention of whoever dominates this house, and when the root is poisonous, the fruit also gets sick." I swallowed hard. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't one to use shallow metaphors. I felt she was telling me that my father was harboring something obscure, and that somehow it was contaminating our lives. I wondered if it could indeed be some practice involving inverted prayers, strange offerings, or something of the sort. Because in New England, many traditions mix Christian blessings, folk magic, European superstitions, local folklore. I didn't know what territory my father might have ventured into, but if someone like Mrs. Jenkins spoke of darkness, it wasn't a mere whim. The situation became even more confusing when Hannah announced she was pregnant. It was on a night when I was returning exhausted to the house. She was waiting for me in the living room, sitting and downcast. "I took the test, Ethan. I'm expecting a child." "It's yours," she said directly, without beating around the bush. Despite the avalanche of uncertainty surrounding us, I was moved and willing to believe her. However, my mother and sister fell more seriously ill right after this news. They barely ate, and the fever seemed unrelenting. What really made me take a step further was a comment I accidentally overheard. My father was talking to Hannah in the backyard of the house late one afternoon, and from the raised tone of voice, I caught fragments like, "You know very well about the agreements. Everything was already defined, even before you appeared here. If you continue like this, the truth will explode." At that moment, something sounded like a definitive alert. I couldn't resist. I scheduled a paternity test at a trusted clinic, using Hannah's blood and secretly mine. I submitted the samples without her knowing, with the excuse that I would be doing routine tests to check my health. I anxiously waited for the following weeks, trying not to show distrust. When the result came out, I had a profound shock. The document indicated that I was not the father of the child. The most surprising thing was that it also showed that the genetic profile didn't match my father's lineage. That possibility was the one that frightened me the most, as I imagined the baby might be his, given the strange intimacy between the two. But the test proved that wasn't the case. Still, nothing explained the hidden cyclicity between Hannah and Richard. With the report in hand, I returned to the clinic to request a complete check and ensured that the information was registered. Then I prepared a dinner and called a family meeting in the living room. I placed the envelope on the table. My mother, pale and weak, sat in an armchair. Lily, leaning against the wall, looked distressed. My father, standing with his arms crossed, stared at each of us. Hannah, beside me, remained silent. I felt my heart beating strongly. This paternity test proves that I am not the father of the child Hannah is carrying. It also shows that she has no blood relationship with you, Dad. But I demand explanations. What's going on between you two? My mother's eyes widened as she brought her hands to her face, and Lily mumbled something I didn't understand. Hannah remained silent. My father then let out a harsh phrase. "Why do you meddle in matters that don't concern you? There have been agreements long before you were born, Ethan, things that involve more than you imagine." That was enough for my already fragile mother to start crying. The situation degenerated into a heavy argument, with my father shouting that he had his reasons, and that everything had been done for the family's good. Hannah hurriedly left the house without saying a word. At the end of that night, only my mother's crying broke the silence. As if that wasn't enough, she fell ill and had to be taken to the local hospital the next day. The days that followed were marked by deeper investigations. I went through rooms that belonged to my father, took old notebooks, checked drawers in his office that I hadn't dared to open before. I ended up finding suspicious notes, newspaper clippings that talked about fraud in public contracts, and evidence that my father was involved with powerful people in Boston, including politicians and businessmen. There were also mentions of concessions that seemed to refer to plots of land or historic houses. I didn't fully understand everything, but it made sense that he had taken advantage of my mother's patrimony to expand corruption schemes. In one of these searches, I found papers that explicitly mentioned Hannah's name. They were old letters exchanged between my father and Nathan, her father. The content was disturbing. Discussions about pacts to guarantee financial advantages and political favors. There seemed to be an arrangement between them related to personal relationships, as if Hannah had been forced to follow a certain route of approach. I confess I felt dirty reading all that, but I needed to know the truth. If she doesn't fulfill what was agreed upon, our entire scheme could collapse, said one excerpt with Nathan's signature. We've been investing in this union for more than 3 years. We can't back down now, was written in another. The situation became clear. My father and Nathan had a kind of conspiracy involving my mother, Hannah, and in a way, me too. I turned over the letters in disbelief. Could this be the source of the torment? Had Hannah been instructed to approach me, but for what purpose? It wasn't clear if she had been coerced or participated willingly. I thought about confronting her, but each day she distanced herself more, while my mother's health deteriorated. Lily also needed medical care to control the fever. The atmosphere in the house became unbearable. My father tried to maintain his composure, but could no longer hide his anger upon seeing that I persisted in investigating. He came to threaten me, looking me in the eyes. Stop poking around where you shouldn't. You still don't understand what's at stake. I went straight to Mrs. Jenkins, taking some of the letters for her to see. I wanted to hear her opinion. The healer, after analyzing everything and asking me to recount what happened in detail, said, "This here is a tangle of intentions. There are people using tricks to gain power and money, mixing ambition with low-level spiritual influences. Your mother's and sister's illness is no coincidence. It's a reflection of so much heavy energy surrounding that house." She recommended intensifying prayers and, above all, taking legal action, as the justice of men would also be necessary. I felt I was at the limit. My mother needed safety. Lily, equally vulnerable, could not continue to be exposed to that environment. I sought a trusted lawyer, Mr. Sullivan, and showed him the documents I had collected. I reported everything I knew about my father's political and financial involvements, and most importantly, about the dubious circumstances of my engagement. Mr. Sullivan advised me to seek legal protection for my mother and Lily. He told me we could alert the authorities based on evidence of irregularities, fraud, and patrimonial manipulation. In a few days, I gathered everything in a dossier and began to take action. Simultaneously, Mr. Sullivan contacted a local prosecutor to investigate my father's links to corruption schemes. It didn't take long for the police to start investigating my father's partners in Boston and neighboring cities. They discovered fictitious offices, falsified documents, and even the possibility of involvement of high-ranking government officials. My mother, although debilitated, had to give statements. Lily was also heard to confirm the tense atmosphere and the threats that hung over our house. Shortly after, I received an anonymous phone call. A female voice, it didn't seem to be Hannah's, warned that I should be careful because there would be retaliation. I already feared for myself and my family, so I intensified the idea of keeping them safe. The court granted a protective measure for my mother and Lily so that my father could not approach them. Reluctantly, he had to leave the house, preferring to stay with some friends in a neighboring town. Mrs. Jenkins continued to visit us, praying for my mother's improvement and cleaning the environments with herbs and prayers. If on one hand, faith is something that cannot be scientifically proven, on the other, I noticed that the atmosphere was calming down over the weeks she was present. Lily began to react, showing signs of recovery. My mother, still fragile, stopped having constant fever and started eating better. And Hannah, as soon as the investigation advanced, she stopped answering my calls. Once in a while, she would exchange short messages saying she needed to resolve pending matters with her family. She no longer appeared at home or at college. I then discovered, through acquaintances, that she had been seen in Boston, supposedly in discreet meetings with her father, Nathan. To me, it became evident that she had distanced herself to avoid getting more deeply involved in the chaos she had helped create, consciously or not. Given this, Mr. Sullivan and I decided to include in the record the paternity test, the letters, and other notes that evidenced Hannah's relationship with my father and her family. This reinforced the argument that there was both effective and patrimonial manipulation and fraud. The prosecutor agreed to attach all this material to the case against my father and his accomplices. The following weeks were turbulent. Several people linked to my father were arrested in the act. Others were summoned to testify. The local press began to report on an alleged scheme of fraud in bids, citing names of public officials, businessmen, and even an influential politician. My father, until then, denied everything. But the house of cards finally collapsed when police searches found a complete file in his office, spreadsheets with bribes, documents of illegal sales, and correspondence that confirmed his involvement in old schemes. When the arrest warrants were issued, the scandal took over radio stations and online newspapers. My father was detained, and on the same day, escorted to the Salem police station. Various media outlets surrounded the door seeking statements from the family. My mother and Lily preferred not to appear in public. I, guided by Mr. Sullivan, just reinforced that I was cooperating with justice. Still at the hospital where my mother was doing some follow-up tests, she told me, "Son, I'm going to file for divorce. I can't live under this shadow anymore." I promptly supported her decision. Shortly after, Lily and I moved to a simpler house, also in the historic district, aiming to preserve my mother from neighborhood rumors and any retaliation. Mrs. Jenkins began to visit her there, and my mother gradually regained the joy of living. The improvement wasn't miraculous, but gradual. I saw in her eyes a spark of hope that I hadn't witnessed for a long time. The divorce process joined all the criminal paperwork. In the end, the court determined that the Victorian house would stay with my mother as part of the agreement. My father, unable to appeal, remained imprisoned awaiting trial. During the hearings, evidence of corruption was presented, and there was no loophole for the defense. He was sentenced to serve time in a closed regime, in addition to having part of his assets frozen to compensate victims and settle debts. As for Hannah, I never saw her in person again. Some people say she moved to New York to stay with an aunt, where she supposedly decided to start life anew. The fact that the paternity test excluded both me and my father as possible fathers of the baby raised the hypothesis that she maintained another relationship, or that the entire pregnancy was part of a plan that escaped my understanding. I still feel something close to compassion for her, as I think she was used as a bargaining chip in shady negotiations from a very young age. When all the dust settled, my mother and Lily recovered. Their health, previously debilitated, gradually returned to normal. I got a job as a researcher at a city museum and strengthened my bond with the university's history department even more. Mrs. Jenkins was considered by us almost as a family member. So many were the times she helped us. After many months, I returned to the old house to fetch some of my belongings that had remained there. Upon entering, I felt a weight in the air. I remembered the nights when my father prowled the corridors, the conversations at the door, the oppressive silences. All the rooms, now empty, seemed full of memories. I passed by the room where my sister had spent feverish nights, by the place where my mother, so gentle, made cookies and breads. The sound of my steps echoed on the wooden floor. In a corner of the living room, one last memory. The note Hannah had written in one of my notebooks in delicate calligraphy, where she said, "We create our own history." I tore out the page, took a deep breath, and left through the door, saying goodbye to that scene of so much pain. It was a relief to close the gate and know that a cycle was finally ending. My mother formally divorced Richard, and justice concluded the case of corruption and family manipulation. My father continues to serve his sentence, and other people linked to the scheme were also held accountable. On the streets of Salem, the subject still yields comments, but gradually life returns to a relative normality. Lily continued with her studies, recovered the lost time, and today thinks about studying nursing to help those who go through health difficulties. I remain involved with research on local history, giving occasional lectures, and making sure that my family has the peace it deserves. The old house, which now stands empty, should be restored someday. Perhaps it will serve as an inn or a cultural center, if my mother so decides. For now, she prefers to leave it closed, as if she were still processing everything she experienced there. We strengthened ourselves after so much anguish, and discovered that certain family ties are more fragile than we imagine, while true affections arise from simple and honest gestures. I will never know exactly how far my father's manipulation practices went. I'm not fully certain if he resorted to inverted prayers, spells, or other forms of mental control. Mrs. Jenkins says there are forces that act in the dark, but she also insists on saying that light is stronger. Perhaps that's enough. The only certainty is that life showed me a dark side of human relationships, something I didn't expect to see so closely. And between pain and learning, there remains my conviction that truth, however bitter, is always the way out of any enigma, including those that haunt our very roots. If you're still listening, let me know what time you're tuning in. I like to know who stays with my stories until the end. Well, let's continue. My name is Connor Sullivan, and I've got 38 years of road in my rear view, though officially I've only been registered as a long-haul trucker for about 17 years. I was born in a small town nestled between the Appalachian Mountains and rivers, with waters the color of rusted iron. Ever since I was a boy, I've had a fascination with trucks. I remember when my grandfather would receive rare visits from distant relatives who'd show up in these massive, rumbling vehicles, bringing pallets of canned goods or bags of flour to supply the general store in our little community. That's where I fell in love with the roar of diesel engines and that unmistakable smell of truck stops and open roads. I've been married to Sarah for 12 years now, and we have a little girl named Emma who just turned 6. The little time I spend with them is precious, as life on the road pushes me away from home for days, or sometimes weeks at a time. I like to think I'm securing my family's future, but I know that each journey is also a small adventure, a new test of patience and endurance. And it was during one of those journeys that something happened, something I'd prefer to forget, but it continues echoing in my mind like a constant warning. That week's haul consisted of electronics components harvested from a distribution center near Portland, with their final destination being an important tech assembler outside of Seattle. We were at the peak of the supply chain crisis, and work never stopped. In a way, that was good. It meant more hauls, more money to pay the bills back home, and more security for Emma's future. I had promised Sarah I'd be on the road for 2 or 3 days, arriving in Seattle the following morning to unload. I needed to drive almost 300 miles to get there. I woke up around 4 in the morning when the sky was still pitch black, but I knew daylight wouldn't be far behind. I kissed my daughter's forehead while she slept, and Sarah, despite being half asleep, got up to give me a tight hug. "Be careful, Connor. You know I get anxious when you leave driving so early. Don't worry, Sarah. I'll do everything by the book. I'll call if anything comes up." She looked at me with that expression of concern that had become all too familiar. I squeezed her hands to signal that everything would be okay. Then I climbed into the cabin and started the engine of my trusted Peterbilt, a longtime partner that never let me down. The dark road seemed to call to me, and I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension as I pulled away. As I gained distance from town, the first light of morning began to appear behind the mountains. The beauty of that dawn painted the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. The still empty asphalt invited me to press on steadily. I crossed through a few small towns and roadside stops, listening to a classic rock station that had accompanied me for as long as I could remember. After several hours, the sun was shining intensely, punishing the road with its typical heat. But around 11 o'clock, the weather changed abruptly, and a passing rain made the journey slower and slippery in certain stretches. This was enough to delay me by about 2 hours beyond what I had planned. To avoid compromising my schedule, I decided to keep driving well after sunset, something I normally avoid because I know American highways can get dangerous at night. Around 7 in the evening, fatigue began to weigh on me. The headlights of oncoming vehicles bothered my eyes, and I was already thinking about finding a safe place to park and rest. That's when I passed a makeshift sign, almost completely faded, indicating a dirt detour that promised to shorten the route by at least 30 miles. If I took that shortcut, I could make up for some of the time lost in the rain. I hesitated, but impatience spoke louder, and I ended up turning right onto that dirt road. The scenery changed immediately. Instead of asphalt, fine dust rose behind the truck and spread like a veil. Even with the headlights, it was hard to see the clearing ahead. The place seemed deserted, without light poles or houses nearby. I felt a slight chill run down my spine as I continued, but I convinced myself that I would soon reach some junction with a less traveled highway. As I advanced, I noticed that the vegetation around became increasingly sparse. typical of certain areas of the Pacific Northwest in late autumn. The twisted trees cast strange shadows when my headlights briefly illuminated them. The clock showed almost 8 at night, and my fatigue was only increasing. That's when, in the middle of the twilight, I spotted what appeared to be a small roadside chapel, with white walls so dirty they barely stood out from the reddish soil. I parked the truck in a recess next to the building and got out to stretch my legs. As soon as I turned off the engine, a profound silence took over the place. Only the wind shook the dry leaves, making a continuous noise. I observed the chapel. It had a semi-open wooden door, and in the diminutive tower was a rusted bell that probably hadn't sounded for decades. The door creaked with each gust, awaking in me an uncomfortable feeling, as if I were being invited to enter. I decided to take a look around before sleeping right there in the cabin. I walked to the entrance, and the darkness of the sanctuary's interior made me hesitate. When I approached, I came across some burned-out candles and withered flowers on a small altar. I didn't see any images of saints or crosses, just soot marks on the walls, possibly from old candles. I had the impression that long ago this place had served as a refuge of faith for travelers, but now it was forgotten. I was almost back at the truck when I heard the sound of soft footsteps on the ground. I turned and noticed an elderly man approaching. He wore simple clothes, worn jeans, and a light flannel shirt. He carried a weather-beaten cowboy hat in his hand. "Evening, son. Do you need any help?" He spoke with a hoarse yet gentle voice. "Good evening." I stopped to rest, but I didn't expect to find anyone out here. This place seems pretty isolated. "Indeed, almost nobody passes through these parts anymore," he replied, looking at the chapel with a melancholic expression. I thought it was a shortcut to cut the journey to Seattle. Many people believe that, but it's not always the best route. The old man walked until he stood before the sanctuary door and remained silent. I noticed he stared into the darkness inside, as if remembering something or waiting for some sign. "Do you live nearby?" I asked. "Not exactly nearby, but I've known these surroundings since I was a child. Many things have happened on this little road over the years." "I imagine so. Deserted roads tend to have stories, don't they?" I tried to start a lighter conversation, though my heart was uneasy. "Stories and secrets. Sometimes secrets that shouldn't be disturbed," he said enigmatically. It was then that I noticed his eyes shining under the weak clarity of the moonlight. He extended his hand in a gesture of farewell. "If you want to rest for a few hours, do so. But if I may give you some advice, don't stay here until too late at night. Thanks for the tip." "What do they call you?" "Folks call me Old Ben." "Good luck, driver. And remember, in the darkness, everything speaks louder." He moved away, disappearing on the dirt trail as if he were part of the wind, leaving me with a strange feeling of alert. I returned to the truck, closed the doors, and decided to eat something before trying to sleep. I opened my lunchbox, a sandwich and some beef jerky that Sarah had prepared. Eating gave me some energy, but I couldn't stop thinking about the old man's words. Around 9:30 at night, I tried to make myself comfortable in the driver's seat to take a nap. The temperature had dropped sharply, and a cold wind penetrated through the cracks in the window. I closed everything and pulled a thin blanket to warm myself. I could barely rest. From time to time, I looked at the chapel through the window, afraid of seeing something moving inside. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke with a start when I heard a distant chant, soft, like a lament or a choir of out-of-tune voices. I got up and through the windshield. I saw that the chapel door was fully open. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't see anyone, but the candles inside seemed lit, flickering. My instinct told me to start the truck immediately and leave. However, I was overcome by a mixture of curiosity and fear. I got out again, now with my heart beating strongly. I took a few steps toward the chapel, but hesitated. It was as if something there both attracted and repelled me at the same time. The fine rain had returned, and the drops on the roof sounded like ghostly drumming. The chant, as strange as it seemed, didn't sound like a foreign dialect, but it also wasn't the typical kind of praying I knew. It was something monotonous and disturbing, echoing from the walls. When I raised my flashlight to illuminate the entrance, the voices stopped suddenly, and a gust of wind blew, throwing a handful of dry leaves in my direction. I couldn't stand it anymore and retreated to the truck, fighting against the impulse to run and leave everything behind. I closed the door, turned the key in the ignition, and felt slight relief hearing the engine roar. Outside, the chapel had returned to darkness, as if what had happened was just a delusion of mine. "I'm not sleeping here, no way," I said out loud, trying to convince myself it was the best decision. I continued along the dirt road, even without being completely sure where it would end. Fatigue and tension dominated me, but at least I was in motion. After traveling a few miles, the trees became denser, forming almost a natural tunnel. I looked in the rearview mirrors to make sure I wasn't being followed. My mind was playing tricks, and at one point, I had the distinct impression of seeing a figure leaning against a tree trunk, but I couldn't distinguish anything clearly. It must have been the result of my nervousness. Half an hour passed, and the little road finally led to a deteriorated asphalt road. There was a small light pole there, which gave me some peace of mind. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was already past 11 at night. The rain was now just a sparse drizzle, but the wind continued. To my left, I spotted the silhouette of an old shack, almost a ruin. I considered stopping to ask for directions, but the gloomy appearance of the place made me continue without hesitating. A few more minutes of progress, and my truck's engine began to fail, one cough, then another, until I had to pull over, afraid of getting stuck in the middle of the road. I opened the hood and tried to check the basics, although my knowledge of mechanics is quite limited. It was dark, and I only had the flashlight to guide me. The wind tousled my hair, and raindrops fell on my back, stiffened by the cold. It seemed like the whole world was challenging me at that moment. I couldn't detect anything abnormal in the cables or oil level. I closed the hood and prepared to start again, praying that the vehicle would function. To my surprise, the engine caught. A sigh of relief escaped my lips as soon as I sat on the seat. I rested my forehead on the steering wheel and breathed deeply, trying to regain some calm. I resumed the journey, but now the road was a winding stretch, going up and down hills. Some curves were so tight that I had to drastically reduce speed. The increasingly dense night enveloped me like a cloak of uncertainties. There was no other car on the road. The radio that I usually kept on to keep me company was silent. only generating static. And it was in that solitude that, through the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something that paralyzes me even now. A slender shadow, darker than the darkness itself, peering through the back of the truck. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of light. However, every time I checked the mirror, I had the sensation of a quick movement back there. Once, twice, 3 times, and with each attempt to focus my gaze, everything disappeared. The memory of the lit candles in the chapel, the disturbing chant, Old Ben's warning, everything mixed together, forming a knot in my head. I just wanted to arrive somewhere inhabited and stop for good. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I began to see signs of civilization. Rusty signs indicated a rural district that, although modest, had brick houses and lights on poles. I drove until I saw a larger construction that turned out to be a functioning gas station. I parked near the pumps, got out to refuel, and was greeted by the attendant, a young and smiling guy wearing blue overalls. "Good evening, Chief. Looks like you took a weird shortcut, huh? Not many people pass through there," he commented, seeing the dusty state the truck was in. "Yeah, it was my idea, but I think I regretted it," I replied, forcing a smile to disguise the tension. "At least you got here in one piece. It's almost 2 in the morning, 2 o'clock. I didn't even notice the time pass. How crazy." I paid for the fuel and decided to talk a bit more with him, still seeking some comfort for my mental state. "Do you know an old chapel back there? It's on the edge of a dirt detour. I think I know which one you mean, but they say it's been abandoned for 3 or 4 decades. Is there someone who shows up there?" I saw an old man with a cowboy hat who advised me to leave before nightfall. Well, I don't remember anyone living nearby, but in places like that, there's always someone passing through. Maybe it was just a wanderer. I nodded without knowing what to respond. I left the young man behind and continued my journey. The cabin clock already showed almost 2:30 in the morning, and I still had more than 90 miles to Seattle. Because of the delay and everything that had occurred, I decided to drive without more stops, wishing only to rediscover some sign of everyday life to feel safe again. The highway, despite being narrow, was paved and offered a less uncertain drive. As I advanced, I noticed that the landscape began to change. The rough terrain gave way to flatter regions closer to a river. Slowly, the lights of small villages appeared on the horizon. I let out a relieved sigh, understanding that I was finally getting back on my normal route. When the sun decided to appear, still weak and uncertain, I reached the metropolitan area of Seattle. The coming and going of cars and motorcycles brought me back to mundane reality. The sensation of having escaped from something unknown provoked in me a mixture of relief and disquiet. I delivered the cargo of electronic components to the assembly plant around 7 in the morning. I received my payment, and when I got down from the truck, I needed to breathe deeply for a few seconds to convince myself that this episode had really ended. I stayed at a modest hotel on the outskirts of the city, planning to rest before heading back home. In the room, I tried to sleep, but couldn't get out of my head the image of that silent chapel, the candles burning on the empty altar, the song that arose without explanation, and above all, Old Ben's words saying that in the darkness, everything speaks louder. I've always considered myself a practical man, but after that night, I confess that I began to respect even more the road stories that before I judged exaggerated or mere superstitions. Today, several weeks later, I continue my work as a trucker, but with a new attitude. I avoid prolonged night departures, plan my routes better, and try not to explore suspicious shortcuts, no matter how much they promise to make me save fuel or time. When someone asks me why I changed my itinerary, I smile awkwardly and say it's just precaution. But deep down, I know I'm running away from that encounter with the unknown, whose memory still haunts me like a distant murmur. The road is like that. It holds secrets in every curve, some beautiful and others disturbing. It's up to us to decide how far we want to peer through the rearview mirror. And although I've never found explanations for what I witnessed, I carry with me the certainty that certain doors, when opened, can show us things we're not prepared to see. Hey folks, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted to all future narrations. I post new videos every day here. Hope to see you in the next ones. Now on the screen, I'm going to leave 2 other good videos that I know you'll enjoy. See you there. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I need to share something that happened to me a few years ago. Even now, I still feel a knot in my throat whenever I recall the details. It all began during a time when I was living in Seattle, a period when my life seemed to have reached its breaking point. I was working at a high-pressure marketing firm where I felt completely suffocated. To make matters worse, I was stuck in a tumultuous relationship that left me feeling more fragile with each passing day. I lived in a constant state of anxiety, barely eating properly and sleeping terribly. In a moment of clarity, I realized that if I continued at that pace, I would end up seriously ill or consumed by depression. In the fall of 2018, I finally took action. I ended my toxic relationship and resigned from my job. I had saved some money, so I decided to take a risk. I wanted to leave Seattle and find a quieter place to start over. That's when my old friend Jessica, whom I'd known since high school, suggested I spend some time in the small town of Oakwood, nestled in rural Vermont. According to her, the place was peaceful, rentals were affordable, and the locals were generally welcoming to newcomers. I didn't think twice. Within 2 weeks, I packed my belongings into my car and drove across the country toward this little town. I arrived on a late autumn afternoon as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The streets were quiet, some still lined with cobblestones. I immediately noticed the simple architecture. Houses with low fences and windows often left open. I stayed at a small bed and breakfast while looking for a suitable place to live. The next day, I contacted a man named Thomas who managed rental properties in the area. He mentioned having a spacious property that was apparently in good condition. Since I was eager to settle in, I agreed to visit without considering other options. When I arrived at the address, I faced an old wrought iron gate that creaked whenever someone opened or closed it. The yard was large with a gnarled apple tree in the right corner. The house itself had a colonial style, built with thick walls typical of old New England homes. It looked somewhat neglected, but nothing that a thorough cleaning and some repairs couldn't fix. The price Thomas quoted was incredibly low, which made me suspicious. I asked if there were any problems with the property. "Well, Miss Mitchell," he said with a slight hesitation, "folks say no one's lived here for quite a while. The previous tenant left suddenly, didn't even ask for his deposit back. But honestly, I think it might have been some family trouble or one of those relative disputes. The current owner just wants to rent the place out quickly. If you're interested, we can sign the contract right now." His smile reminded me of a typical salesman's, but I signed the lease right there, feeling somewhat apprehensive yet strangely excited. The house had potential, and I desperately needed a place to rebuild my life. I spent the first few days cleaning and organizing the basics. Despite its abandoned appearance, nothing seemed particularly frightening. Yes, the wooden beams in the living room creaked, and at night they made noises, but I convinced myself that sounds in old houses were normal. After about a week, I began to notice subtle things that made me uncomfortable. One night, while making tea in the kitchen, I heard light footsteps in the hallway. I thought it might be a stray cat, but when I went to check, I found only a dark, empty corridor. The following day, I observed something strange in the laundry area, a small pile of sawdust, as if someone had been sanding wood in that exact spot. But there was no sign of any damaged door or furniture. I swept it up and tried to forget about it. As time passed, I began to perceive a heavy energy in the rooms. The air seemed denser, especially in the bedroom where I slept. Initially, I convinced myself it could be psychological. I had experienced trauma, was in an unfamiliar house. Perhaps my emotional state was projecting fear where there was nothing. So one afternoon, I decided to air out the bedroom by opening all the windows. During the night, I was awakened by a sharp sound, as if someone had knocked on the wall right next to my bed. My heart raced as I quickly got up, turned on the light, and saw nothing. The window was inexplicably closed again, though I had no memory of closing it. Things worsened by the third week. I began having constant nightmares. I dreamed of a hunched woman wearing a headscarf who would stand in the corner of my room, just watching me. I couldn't see her face, but I felt a strong presence. I would often wake up sweating, breathing heavily, and the memory of the dream would stay with me throughout the day. During this period, I was so disturbed that I avoided being alone in the house at night. I would leave the radio on or keep the television at high volume, trying to ignore the sounds coming from the empty rooms. One particular night, I woke up startled by a scratch on my left arm. It looked as if someone had dragged a fingernail across my skin. I was terrified. My room was dark, but I was certain I saw a silhouette near the door. When I turned on the lamp, the silhouette vanished. Fear took hold of me to the point where I couldn't go back to sleep. The situation became unbearable when one morning I found small muddy tracks on the kitchen floor that resembled barefoot prints, possibly belonging to a child or a small person. I followed these marks through the yard until they stopped near the apple tree, where they simply disappeared. I got goosebumps. I decided to seek help from someone in the neighborhood. That's when I met Mrs. Alina, an elderly woman who sold homemade pies on Main Street and was well known in the area for her prayers and blessings. I told her part of my story, of course, without mentioning all the details for fear of sounding crazy. She listened attentively, made the sign of the cross, and said, "My dear, Old houses tend to hold memories and impressions of those who passed through them. If there was great sadness or something evil there, it stays embedded in the place. You need to pray, place a protective plant by the door, and if necessary, we can perform a stronger ritual. She spoke in a serious tone, but without judgment. I accepted Mrs. Alina's offer, and that same afternoon, she came to my house bringing a sprig of rosemary and a small container of sea salt. We walked through the rooms while she sprinkled holy water in the corners, praying softly. I felt a momentary relief, as if the air had become fresher. Still, deep down, I knew I would continue to have problems. The elderly woman warned me that if there was something deeper lurking there, more than a blessing would be needed. Indeed, the improvement lasted only briefly. 2 nights later, I had such a vivid nightmare that I woke up crying. I dreamed I was trapped in a dark room, looking at the door from which emerged the same headscarf-wearing woman, murmuring something incomprehensible. When she raised her head, I saw a pair of empty eyes, as if there was nothing there. I woke up screaming, my entire body trembling. I was on the verge of collapse when I decided to speak with Mrs. Alina again. But before doing so, I found a surprise in my mailbox, an envelope with no return address. Inside was a crumpled letter with strange writing. "You will never be alone. She still lives in this house." That note left me so shaken that I nearly fainted. Who could have written it? Did they know what was happening to me? I took the letter to Mrs. Alina, who frowned upon reading it. "Child, some people take advantage of others' weakness to spread evil. This house has a history. I've heard that it once belonged to a family involved with strange practices, powerful rituals. You need stronger help. Don't stay here alone," she advised with a worried expression. It was then that I made it a point to discover as much as possible about the house's past. I spoke with Thomas, the man who had rented me the property, and he confessed that years before, a man named Raymond had lived there with his mother, who was a healer or supposed witch, depending on who was telling the story. She had a reputation for solving problems by requesting promises and offerings. One day, she disappeared without a trace. Her son, Raymond, moved away suddenly and was never heard from again. Neighbors said his mother might have done something dangerous, some kind of spell to harm someone, but it spiraled out of control. I didn't know what to believe, but the pieces were starting to fit together. I told Mrs. Alina everything I had discovered. She advised me to perform a deeper spiritual cleansing, but also suggested caution. If the woman was involved with these more powerful things, she might have left something bound to the house. Sometimes an object, a piece of clothing, a note with someone's name. You need to search thoroughly, look in places no one has touched. I admit I hesitated because I was terrified, but the more I delayed, the more intense the strange events became. I heard whispers in the kitchen, cold drafts in the hallway, and the nightmares repeated almost every night. Finally, one weekend, I mustered my courage and went to the small cellar behind the kitchen, where only a few old boxes and cobwebs had accumulated. I searched everything with the help of a flashlight. At a certain point, I noticed that part of the floor sounded slightly hollow. With some difficulty, I dragged away a box and discovered a hidden compartment. Inside, I found a heavily rusted metal can. I almost gave up on opening it, but curiosity and fear drove me forward. When I lifted the rusty lid, I came across a dusty fabric bundle. I carefully unwrapped it to find a clump of tied hair, a small bone, which I couldn't identify as animal or human, and a yellowed paper with symbols I couldn't decipher. My heart raced when I saw that on the back of the paper was written the name Sarah Mitchell, written in the same manner as in the letter I had received. I almost dropped everything as I returned to the living room, trembling. I sat on the sofa for a few minutes, trying to make sense of it all. How could my name appear on an old spell if I had never set foot in that house before? Had someone updated this macabre work and inserted my name? I thought about everyone from my past who might wish me harm, but nothing made sense. The next day, I sought out Mrs. Alina again, showing her the bundle. She examined each item with a serious look, as if confirming her suspicions. She said it all indicated some kind of curse directed at someone. But if it had my name on it, it could mean someone had manipulated the spell more recently. Do you have any old friendship that turned bitter? An ex? Someone who dislikes you? She asked. I then remembered Vanessa, a former coworker with whom I had several disagreements shortly before quitting my job. It was never anything so serious that I would have thought of witchcraft, but perhaps people sometimes go to extremes out of envy or resentment. I confessed to Mrs. Alina that yes, there was this adversary in my past, but I had no proof she could be behind any of this. The prayer woman explained that if the ritual had been activated in some way, a stronger spiritual work would be needed. According to her, when we discover such an object hidden in a secluded place, it means the energy is alive and active. It wasn't enough to throw it away. The spell needed to be broken properly. So we arranged a ritual for that same week at her house, located on a small farm a few miles away. It was one of the most tense nights of my life. I arrived at the farm around 7 in the evening. There, Mrs. Alina had a small altar with images of saints, colored candles, and hanging herbs. She instructed me to sit in a chair next to a table, where the rusted can and fabric bundle were placed. Around them was a circle made of coarse salt. She lit some candles, burned herbs in a censer, and began to pray. I felt a strong pressure in my chest, as if something was pulling me from within. I tried to stay calm, but at one point, I had the impression of hearing a female voice murmuring my name from the corner of the room. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell. Terrified, I closed my eyes tightly, mentally praying for it to stop. Mrs. Alina was exclaiming words I didn't understand. It seemed like a mixture of prayers and ancient chants. Suddenly, I heard a pop, as if one of the candles had burned too quickly. I opened my eyes and saw that the flame had increased in size, and then weakened in the blink of an eye. Everything became calm, but the smell of incense was overwhelming. I left there feeling dizzy, thinking I might faint. She helped me lie down on a small bench. When I caught my breath, Mrs. Alina said she had managed to nullify much of the negative energy, but that I would need to be vigilant in the coming days. Burning the items wasn't enough. Ideally, they should be buried in a remote place where the earth could absorb that evil charge. And until we did that, there was a risk that something might still torment us. I returned home exhausted and slept for about 4 hours straight. The next day, I noticed with some relief that I no longer heard footsteps in the hallway or felt that unbearable density in the rooms. I gathered my courage and went to bury the objects in a vacant lot near an old chapel. I did it all alone very early, without telling anyone. I dug a reasonably deep hole and threw the can and its contents in there. I prayed as Mrs. Aliner had taught me, asking for freedom and protection. The sensation was strangely liberating. For several days, everything seemed to return to normal. I had no more nightmares. I could sleep better. And I even started planning to look for a job in town or give private English lessons, since that was my area of expertise. I felt like I was regaining control of my life. The problem was that shortly afterward, something even more disturbing happened. My niece Lucy, only 6 years old, came to visit me, accompanied by my sister, who was going to spend the weekend with me. On Saturday morning, Lucy was playing in the yard while my sister and I prepared lunch. Suddenly, the little girl came running in, frightened. "Aunt Sarah, there's a lady outside. She's barefoot and just stares at me." I called her to play, but she didn't say anything. My heart froze. I ran to the yard, but saw no one. Lucy insisted she had seen a tall woman with bare feet and a headscarf standing by the apple tree. I searched the entire yard, went to the gate, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Yet the girl didn't seem to be making it up, as she spoke with absolute conviction. That same Saturday night, Lucy woke up screaming, saying that the lady from the yard was at the bedroom window. My sister, frightened, said she hadn't seen anything. But when we went to check, the window was open even though we had closed everything at nightfall. It was as if somehow that presence I had been sensing had managed to reveal itself to my niece. My sister, understandably terrified, decided to leave the next day, saying that place gave her the chills. I was devastated, not knowing what to do. I immediately called Mrs. Aliner, asking for guidance. She asked me to stay calm and return to her farm on Monday for another liberation prayer. However, I couldn't wait that long. In the early hours of Sunday, I was awakened by a bang on the front door, as if someone were knocking violently. When I opened it, I found nothing except a small package with the same symbol that was on the yellowed paper of the spell. I was about to flee, to abandon the house, when I realized it wouldn't help much. Perhaps the problem was attached to me, not just to those four walls. I needed to resolve this once and for all. So on Monday, as soon as dawn broke, I rushed to Mrs. Aliner's house. She received me with puffy eyes, looking as if she had slept poorly. I told her about the package, and she frowned. "This isn't good. If we buried the objects, and there's still someone reinforcing them, it means someone is involved. We need to find out if it's this Vanessa. If she's messing with powerful things, she won't give up easily." I spent the following weeks without getting any concrete leads on Vanessa. She had moved away from Seattle, and I couldn't find any updated contact information. Meanwhile, the supernatural signs decreased, but didn't disappear completely. The hallway would suddenly turn cold. I heard occasional crackling at night, and every now and then, I had the strange feeling of being watched, even inside the house. About a month passed, and life was proceeding somewhat without major surprises, until I received a phone call from an unknown number one rainy afternoon. I answered, and on the other end, the person was breathing heavily without speaking, but I could hear a faint whisper. "You're still there, Sarah Mitchell. You'd better leave." Then the line went dead. I was in shock. The voice was female, but I couldn't associate it with any acquaintance. I spent the rest of that day turning over in my mind, trying to connect the dots. Around 7 in the evening, I decided to go to bed early. I turned off all the lights and locked the doors. The sound of rain outside helped me relax, but in the middle of the night, I awoke to the same female voice near my ear. "Sarah Mitchell, leave now." I opened my eyes and saw only darkness. I fumbled for the lamp and took a few seconds to find the switch. When the faint light came on, I saw that the bedroom door was open, and I felt a cold draft in the hallway. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. My heart was nearly jumping out of my chest, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I gathered the courage to get up, but before I could take 2 steps, I heard 3 sharp knocks on the front door of the house. I didn't want to answer, I confess. I was paralyzed, unable to act. Then I heard Mrs. Alina's voice calling my name. I quickly opened the door to find her soaked from the rain. "I'm sorry for the hour, child, but I had a premonition. I came to see if you were all right," she said as she entered, closed her umbrella, and as soon as she stepped into the living room, let out a heavy sigh. "There's something here, isn't there?" she murmured, looking around. That's when I decided to tell her everything that had happened that day. The phone call, the voice in my bedroom, the open bedroom door, the knocking at the front door. Mrs. Alina took a small bag of herbs from her pocket and began to pray quietly. She went through all the rooms, lighting white candles she had brought in her bag. We heard creaking above the beams. The entire house seemed to tremble. At one point, one of the living room window panes cracked, and an icy wind blew in. I've dedicated my life to praying and dealing with these things, but it's never easy, she commented with a sweaty forehead. This is coming from outside, someone who doesn't want you to stay, perhaps out of envy, grudge, or something worse. I think my prayers won't be enough. Then she asked me to make a decision. Either I would face this evil directly and definitively, or I should leave that house and never return. I remembered all the effort I had made to get there, how I was trying to rebuild my life. I didn't want to run away again. I asked Mrs. Alina to help me with whatever was possible. She suggested inviting an acquaintance of hers, a pastor who had experienced blessing places considered spiritually heavy. Within a few days, we managed to schedule a visit from Pastor Michael, a man with a calm voice but a perceptive gaze. He and Mrs. Alina had a curious partnership. Despite belonging to different belief systems, they respected each other and wanted to help people. Together, they arrived at my house on a Saturday afternoon, the same time I had done the first cleansing with Mrs. Alina. They prayed in the yard, sprinkled holy water in the rooms, and lit candles in every corner. I knelt in the living room, holding their hands, trying to maintain faith and focus on their work. Nothing too spectacular happened at that moment, but amazingly, I felt a lightness take over me in the hours that followed. It was as if the environment had been relieved of a weight. Pastor Michael said he would need to return 2 more times to make sure everything was fine. Mrs. Alina thought it prudent for me to find a job or activity in town, so I wouldn't spend so much time alone in the house. Indeed, I decided to look for private tutoring opportunities, and soon had a few students in the nearby neighborhood. Weeks passed, and I didn't receive any more strange messages or midnight visits. The yard seemed brighter, the house more airy. Gradually, I built a routine. I taught in the mornings, returned for lunch, reviewed my teaching materials, and in the evenings allowed myself to watch movies, listen to music, and relax. There was still a deep apprehension within me, but it was as if everything had calmed down. One day, however, upon returning from the supermarket, I found a note stuck to the door. "I know who you are." I was stunned. My first reaction was to tear off the paper and crumple it, but I noticed it had the same symbol as that bundle from the cellar. The shock was great because after so many rituals and efforts, the nightmare seemed to threaten a return. I left the groceries in the kitchen, took a deep breath, and immediately called Mrs. Aliner. She answered with a concerned voice. It could be someone spying on you, but it could also be the residual energy of whoever commissioned this evil. We can't let our guard down. As a precaution, I decided to leave for a few days. I went to Jessica's house in Seattle, the same friend who had encouraged me to come to Oakwood. I told her the whole story in detail. She was dumbfounded, especially about the spells and the name Sarah Mitchell written on the papers. She suggested I stay there indefinitely, but I felt that running away again wouldn't solve anything. If it was supernatural, it could follow me wherever I went. And if it was someone real persecuting me, I needed to find out who it was. 2 weeks later, I returned to the small town, determined to face whatever came my way. I found the house in perfect order. Nothing had been broken into. There was no new note, no signs of invasion. Apparently, everything was as I had left it. This gave me the courage to continue. I reinforced the locks, bought extra padlocks, and began to better connect with the neighbors to create a support network. In doorstep conversations, I discovered that some people were indeed afraid of that place. A lady named Eve told me, "They say Raymond's mother did spells to break up couples, cause illness, and even ruin other people's businesses." The neighborhood folk saw strange things in that house, but to be honest, some people also exaggerate the stories. Despite the contradictory versions, the fact was that it wasn't just a legend. Some influence still haunted the place. Even so, I clung to the hope that the cleansing done by Mrs. Aliner and Pastor Michael had a lasting effect. At least I didn't have nightmares for a good while. If I heard a strange noise, I tried to think rationally. It could be the roof wood, the wind, some animal in the yard. But then came the final surprise that made me understand how human malice can feed dark things. One late afternoon, I received a visit from a former coworker who was passing through the area. It was none other than Vanessa, the person I suspected. She arrived without warning, rang the doorbell, and introduced herself with a strange smile. She said she was traveling on business and had found out where I lived. I was shocked that she had discovered my address. We talked in the living room, and she initially appeared friendly, asking about my new direction, but deep down, I felt tension in the air, as if there was a stored resentment. When I carefully asked if she knew anything about the letters and strange objects I had found, she gave an ironic little laugh. "You always loved drama, Sarah Mitchell. I think you're seeing ghosts where there aren't any. I don't know anything, just wanted to see if you were doing well." After that, she left, apparently without leaving a trace. But her visit was enough for me to start having nightmares again, that very night nightmares, with the same hunched woman looking at me from the corner of the room. I felt a deep anger, as if Vanessa's presence had rekindled something inside the house. The next day, I picked up the phone and called Mrs. Alina, telling her every detail of my ex-colleague's sudden appearance. She thought it was too much of a coincidence. I don't doubt that this young woman did something against you, child. If she's so sure of herself, she might have come back just to see how you're reacting. After this unexpected visit, the phenomena diminished, but I felt a looming threat, as if the force that had been tormenting me had manifested strongly and was now merely retreating. I continued living in the house, working, and making friends in town. I maintained frequent contact with Mrs. Alina and Pastor Michael, who said they prayed for me. I never received any more notes or packages, nor did I see the headscarf figure in the yard. Days resumed their normalcy, and my life began to flow better. I still can't say for certain whether the haunting, or whatever it was, disappeared definitively or just quieted down. I can't prove that Vanessa really cast a spell. On the other hand, I can't help but think about how it all coincided with the period when she was full of resentment, and how the house already had a heavy history. Be that as it may, I learned the value of staying alert and respecting people's beliefs. I realized there are phenomena we can't explain, especially when mixed with human malice or resentment. Today, I still live in Oakwood, but I've renovated much of the house, making it a welcoming home full of plants and natural light. Every week, I place a glass with water and salt in the corner of the living room. I pray before sleeping and try to maintain peace of mind. The nightmares have almost completely disappeared, and only occasionally, on quiet nights, do I hear something like a light dragging of feet in the hallway. I prefer to believe it's just the wooden floor, but deep down, I know it's good to keep my eyes open. After all, certain energies, once awakened, don't disappear so easily. My story may sound absurd, but I swear I lived through every detail. I confess that if I had known myself a few years ago, I probably wouldn't have believed half of what I've told you. But after everything I've been through, I understand there's much we still don't comprehend about what surrounds us. Perhaps this evil that affected me was partly human, partly supernatural. I rely on the faith and courage I've developed, hoping that if something like this ever happens again, I'll have the strength to face it. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive upcoming stories. Your presence is important, and your support is essential. Now let's continue. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.